Agreeni Ushla Illa. Councillor Liam Blaney, Cahirlock of Donegal County Council, is now arriving on parade.
Governor, Cortege General to Donegal, arm! Governor, Humphrey, arm! Governor, seek cross. Governor, guard,
Agreeni Ushla. The Minister of State at the Department of Transport and the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications, Mr. Jack Chambers TD, is now arriving on parade.
Governor, Cortege General to Donegal, arm! Governor, Humphrey, arm! Governor, seek cross. Governor, guard,
Agreeni Ushla, ladies and gentlemen, on Tuchtaran Michael D. Higgins is now arriving on parade.
Governor, Cortege then Tuchtaran, Donegal, Arm! Gardner! Humphrey! Arm!
Uachtaráin, Captain O'Flanagan, I bhail, Gardner, Fé Uachtu, an Colin Kiste. Tá an Gardner Ullov I gcór do Gigar Uachta. Uachtaráin. Uachtaráin, an bhfuil Cladagan, Gardner, Scopi.
Aguini Ushla, Lewerdel, Bigi Urhiaslov, August Falchigi Rig Uthran Naheran, Mihal D. O'Higgins. Ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding to welcome the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins.
Gardner! Feeney! Arm! Gardner! Hang up! Hey! Hey!
Aguini Ushla, ladies and gentlemen, you may be seated. Aguini Ushla, ladies and gentlemen, an Tara Stach agus an Rin Umper, agus an Rin Cosail, Eraja agus Cummersodge, the Minister of State at the Department of Transport and the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications, Mr. Jack Chambers, TD, will now give the welcome address.
Gurmagat is honor war dum sevan show e balien na galolach kunde dunanyal Har cean an rialtas don chomór stát seo ócáid chomór náisiúnta an gcuirte mhór fiche trí agus fearm fir chuoin fáilte ró a bhile. It is a great honour for me to welcome you to this year's National Famine Commemoration in Milford on behalf of the Chair of the National Famine Commemoration Committee, Minister Catherine Martin TD. I'm especially pleased to acknowledge the President, Michael D. Higgins, who will lead the official representation during today's event. I would like to welcome His Excellency the Most Reverend Louis Mariano Montemer, Apostolic Nuncio and Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, and the Cathaoirleach of Donegal County Council, Liam Blaney, who will participate in today's wreath-laying ceremony. I would also like to welcome the many members of the Diplomatic Corps with us today. I'm very thankful to the family of Seamus Heaney for the use of his poem At a Potato Digging, which we will hear today. The scene he evokes in this piece of rotting tomatoes being dug from the earth is mirrored in the image behind me today from the National Library of Ireland collection, which depicts a family in that moment of awful realisation that the potato crop has failed and hunger looms. It is particularly appropriate that today's event is being held here in Donegal, where the impact of the Great Famine and its legacy of emigration shaped the lives of its communities and people for far too long. But today is also an opportunity to honour the courage and determination of those who are forced to leave these shores. Despite the challenges and horrors they faced, they flourished and created a thriving diaspora which continues to maintain its connection to Ireland. An important aspect of the National Famine Commemoration is the involvement of the local community who host the event. In the first instance, we are grateful to John Stewart for making this site of the Milford Workhouse available to use for today's commemoration. There's been great community engagement in the lead up today, especially from children from many of the local schools who are taking part in today's ceremony, and those who have contributed to a wide array of artistic pieces that engage with the themes of the Great Famine. I'm happy to say a selection of these will be displayed in the reception area following the ceremony. I would like to thank the local musicians of Ceoltas, Ceoltarí Éireann, Mael Rua, who will provide music for the ceremony today. The vibrancy and immediacy of the music that we will hear from them today is a very palpable reminder of the great musical tradition that stretches back to the famine and beyond, but particularly here in Donegal. Similarly, the strong storytelling tradition is represented here today by Ethni Gallagher, who will be leading local stories from the invaluable school folklore collection. Few embody the many aspects of the rich culture of Donegal as much as Mairead Nimweni, who will be performing as part of today's ceremony together with Steve Cooney. As a member of Alton, a founder of Cardias na Fidleri, and through her solo work, her contribution to the spread and promotion of the Donegal fiddle music and traditional singing is absolutely immense. The song they'll be playing today, Dún the Húil, also known as the Famine Lullaby, is poignant in its simplicity and tenderness. A mother trying to protect and comfort her child in a time of disease and death, a situation none of us scarcely wish to imagine. Yet despite the spectre of starvation, she is resilient and focused on a brighter future. This, I think, encapsulates the sense of hope that carried those who faced the loss of everything dear to them through such upheaval and tragedy. Organisations and individuals like those performing today who preserve and promote traditional music, dance and the language of Ireland ensure that the culture, the passions and the voices of those who suffered most during the Great Famine are not erased, but instead live on and thrive through each generation. On Minister Martin's behalf, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the members of the National Famine Commemoration Committee for all their work in ensuring the Great Famine is remembered and commemorated in an appropriate manner. In closing, I would also like to acknowledge Donegal County Council, the Office of Public Works, the Defence Forces, An Garda Síochána, the staff of the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media, and all those who have worked on today's arrangements. Maruchel Skur Bwalum Buichas Agao Levilig Asve Egan Shermanus inu Honachinsu go Gwibnitzer Earsportach an Gortabor Le Mas Agus Ledinitz Gurv Mahagwiv.
Agrini Ushla. I now invite the President, Michael D. Higgins, to address us. Aukdran.
Arastoid, cohielig, colacuna, the nanal, art weary, Dane agus build and cocal, then diplomatique, representatives of the National Famine Commemoration Committee, Iana Iliok is a cordia. Is cushion ora dam marok trane herin, a vehe gorl a muintane herin, agus iadsan will see marka cultura star ne herin. Is kama kuin kunsha ta arhagas muite komora, an actori is tavakti beder akis tobberstaka arastara, an gortamor. Tommy de tort kun kuivna selta basana, agus strakalt na nini a kailegar in a treifsha tragodi, a liaga gar muinterne her in quirter, jedele sula in a mask on gortamor. It is my honour and privilege as President of Ireland to join with fellow Irish people, friends of Ireland, and those with an interest in Ireland and its history, wherever they may be and in whatever circumstances, as we mark the cataclysmic events from our past, and in particular that we recall the lives, deaths, and suffering of all those individuals who perished during that tragic event imposed on Irish people that we refer to as An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, the Irish Famine. Today, designated as it is National Famine Commemoration Day, is one of the most important days for commemoration in Ireland, in my view. It is an opportunity for the people of this island to reflect on and recall the suffering and loss of that period in our history, to remember those who fled to create new lives abroad, and reflect on the best lessons that we might take from such a recall and how it might influence our contemporary lives and the lives of others. The salient facts are known. Between 1760 and 1815, the availability of cheap food in the form of the potato and cheap fuel in the form of turf had permitted the Irish population to expand prodigiously. However, the diet of the labouring poor became ever more potato dependent, and by the 1830s, 1/3 of the population, 3 million people, relied on potatoes for over 90% of the calorific input. In these circumstances, a failure of the potato crop would precipitate disaster. Repeated failures would simply decimate the population. The unprecedented attack of Itaphora infestans destroyed 1/3 of the crop in 1845, 3/4 in 1846 and 47, and 1/3 in 1848. Massive mortality, followed by emigration, ensued. 1 million died, and 2 million more emigrated in the next 2 decades, cruelly paralleling the 3 million potato people who had become totally dependent on the tuber in the pre-famine period. These deaths were disproportionately concentrated in the south and west of Ireland and among the poorest people. This is the 3rd time the state commemoration has taken place in Ulster, and may I say how pleased I am to be here today in Milford. The location of this year's National Famine Commemoration here in Donegal is particularly welcome given the deferral of the hosting of the 2020 event in Donegal due to the pandemic. The setting here, as you have heard at the old site of the Milford Workhouse, is also so appropriate given the adversity endured by the people of Donegal in the face of poverty, hunger and emigration throughout the 19th century, and in particular during the Great Hunger. It is indeed a singularly appropriate venue for such a commemoration too, as Hugh Dorian of Fonnet, while in the Milford Poor Law Union, wrote an extensive and moving account of Garthamore and its transformation of his home place, an account which has been brought to the public by Professor Brendan McSuin and David Dixon. And this peerless account of the famine from below is so well distilled in the old Irish proverb, Ní Higgin an Sach an Shen. The satiated will never understand the emaciated. In a paper entitled The Grey Zone of the Great Famine, Professor McSwithne refers to Skibbereen dispensary doctor Daniel Donovan's written account in 1847 of the moral consequences of the famine, its ingress on the lives and perceptions of the people. I quote, "Another symptom of starvation, and one that accounts for the horrible scenes that it usually exhibits, is the total insensibility of the sufferers to every other feeling except supplying their own wants. I have seen mothers snatch food from the hands of their starving children, known a son to engage in a fatal struggle with a father for a potato, and have seen parents look on the putrid bodies of their offspring without evincing a symptom of sorrow. Such is the inevitable consequence of starvation, and it is unfair to attribute to inherent faults in our people the moral degradation to which they are at present reduced, and which is inseparable from a state of severe physical privation. Garthamore is a watershed in Irish history, constituting as it does the greatest social catastrophe in terms of mortality and suffering, one that has had profound consequences on demographics, politics, culture, religion, agriculture, and industry. The legacy of Garthamore is complex, deep, wide, and has many strands that have impacted on the Irish collective psyche, as well as at the individual level. Its legacy is one of involuntary emigration, culture loss, demoralization, and loss of confidence, both in terms of population and in terms of its impact on the Irish language, and the marks this would have on the country, and in particular on Irish society, ramifications that still play out today on so many levels. Although we have established and accepted, particularly through recent historiography and an expansion of local studies, a number of more detailed facts pertaining as to its causes and consequences, and it is an event for which an apology has been issued on behalf of the British government, dating from 1997, the 150th anniversary of Black 47. We can acknowledge the many different elements that make up the story of Ireland's greatest disaster, its causes, contents, and consequences, and to code them levels of importance as to sources and consequences of Garthamore. Ideological assumptions as to essence and practices of the Irish as inferior are at the very root of the economic theory and practices that allowed Garthamore to have the final impacts it had. Ireland was, as quote, a nation perishing of political economy, to quote Church of Ireland clergyman Richard Townsend, who devoted his time in Skibbereen and Schull to the care of the poor and sick, where the death rate was over 50%. A sense of moralism pervaded among educated ruling Britons of the time, ascribing fundamental defects from which the native Irish were perceived to suffer as moral rather than financial defects of the Irish national character, including disorder or violence, filth, laziness, and worst of all, a lack of self-reliance. This was unambiguous, xenophobic, racial, and cultural stereotyping, for these are classic misinterpretations, tools of othering. The changes in agricultural practice that were taking place in Ireland in the late 19th century, for example, those in response to external demand for agricultural product, leading to expanding exports, the changes from labor-intensive tillage to grazing, which was labour intensive. Many of these changes were brought about by clearances, eviction, in so many instances. Such clearances and evictions had a devastating effect on the poorest, who were dependent on a single food source. When during the famine that single food source, the lumper potato having failed, they starved, what followed remains the single most important event in forming and giving form to, for Irish people, a distinctive form of relationship to the land, to immigration, and to politics in the decades that followed. One defined by the famine catastrophe and its human aftermath. For the Irish people who survived, the determination to survive, whether at home or abroad, was endured at a terrible cost. The role of laissez-faire economics must be not only included but indeed forefronted in any description as to the causes of An Gorta Mór. Crucially, in response to an escalating loss of life, Britain could have prohibited the export of grain from Ireland, especially during the winter of 1846-7 and early in the following spring when there was little food in the country. Even in the brief period when meal was imported, the government could have taken steps to ensure that this imported food was distributed to those in greatest need. The government could have continued its soup kitchen scheme for a longer time, which was allowed only to be effective for just 6 months, from March to September 1847, despite it being relied on it for providing food for up to 3 million people and proving to be both effective and inexpensive. The decision by government to end it prematurely was again a policy of non-interventionism, supporting the Whigs' belief as to how government and society should function. Daniel O'Connell visited the building where I now live, known now as Áras an Uachtaráin, then the Vice-Regal Lodge, to plead with the Viceroy to stop the export of grain. The Nationalist Freeman's Journal, reporting that the delegation had been received very coldly, stated that Lord Heytesbury's attitude to the Irish poor could be summed up by the phrase, "They may starve." Such doctrines of inaction were founded on an ideological and authoritarian tendency of the strength and right to impose that was widely supported in the domain of politics, one that was confident of its place among those who held power, to impose a pernicious economic orthodoxy that would allow for the sanctioning of poverty amidst plenty, conspicuous assumption amidst mass starvation, all rationalized by an ideology that felt unchallenged too in elevating a suggested absolute right of poverty above that of natural law, while consigning an immoral duty of humanity, ethical duty of government, or of even basic concern to passive acts of charity. Such voluntary acts, including those of James Hack Tuke and his son, were indeed of an heroic nature. They, members of the Society of Friends, dying of fever themselves, as Tuke did in the service of the poor of the west of Ireland. Let us not forget, too, that a sense of providentialism guided the policies of the government of the time. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official, in charge of famine relief, in his 1848 book, The Irish Crisis, offered the following justification for it all. With the direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, the sharp but effectual remedy by which the cure is likely to be effected, one which lays bare the deep and inveterate root of social evil, God grant that the generation to which this great opportunity has been offered may rightly perform its part. This may indeed be a desperate attempt at rationalization of his abandonment of an earlier and desperate effort at importing yellow meal, that was one that was abandoned to comply with government-imposed policy, and the consequences, however, are undeniable. It is when we acknowledge the facts of what has been omitted too often from the generally accepted narrative of An Gorta Mór, and speculate on the full ideological content and its influence on policy, that we are best prepared to use our own famine experience in such a way as might generate an appropriately ethical response to the obscenity of recurring famines in our own time in different parts of our shared vulnerable planet. On Garthamore, the famine had a devastating effect on the people of Donegal, where we are gathered today. During the Great Hunger, Donegal had a population of nearly 300,000 people, more than 2/3 of whom were involved in agriculture, using but 1/3 of the county's land. The diet of the time consisted of potatoes and, where available in some areas, herring, salt, stirabout, and milk. Clothing was meagre and wretched. Furniture in the hovels was pitiful, and bedding was scarce. Living conditions were overcrowded and smoky. And there are several European accounts, as well as British ones, reporting on such conditions, particularly in the 1830s. Despite the 1838 Poor Relief Act providing some assistance for the poor, very little impact was felt by the starving and diseased population. The workhouses failed to provide reasonable living conditions, were substandard and in a poor state. James Hack-Tuke, that young Quaker from England and a sympathetic witness who would later distribute relief on behalf of the Society of Friends, was appalled by what he witnessed. He described the destitute in Donegal as crying from hunger when he visited the Glenties workhouse. He realized that the condition of people in receipt of so-called official relief was little better than the hovels reporting. Their bedding consisted of dirty straw in which they were laid in rows on the floor. The living and the dying were stretched side by side beneath the same miserable covering. Disease and pestilence are filling the infirmary. The pale, haggard countenance of the poor boys and girls told of sufferings which it was impossible to contemplate without pity. As the decade wore on, the workhouses reported outbreaks of typhus among their inmates, and as a result would not admit any more in need. Destitution reigned in Donegal during the harsh winter of 1846-7, despite some relief from a Belfast charitable association. The parish of Glencullamkill lost 17% of its population through disease, starvation, and emigration. Conditions in Arranmore were described by an American visitor in the same year, 1847. No food, apart from bits of turnip and seaweed, and still the blight continues to spread. Sowing of potatoes had decreased by 90%, and sowing of turnips had increased 8-fold. With workhouses full to capacity, fever and pestilence stretching from Ballyshannon to Moville, high unemployment and relief slow in coming, owing to primitive transportation and the distance from Dublin, which was the centre of famine relief. Emigration to Canada, America, and Scotland was desperately sought, seen as the best route out of the misery for those who could manage to find the fare. Emigration from the region was principally through the port of Derry, creating communities such as the Stranorlar diaspora in places such as Greenock in Scotland, Brunswick in Canada, and elsewhere in Australia and the United States. Owing to this widespread emigration, communities such as Stranorlar grew in strength abroad, and at the height of the famine, emigrants embarking from the port of Derry numbered over 12,000. Of the 80,000 Irish who settled in Scotland between 1846 and 1851, most of whom left from Derry, many landed in Glasgow, but more than half, 41,275, were repatriated back to Ireland by the civic authorities in the subsequent 5 years. In an article entitled Irish Destitution and Disease in Glasgow, the Glasgow Courier newspaper wrote, "Without the slightest exaggeration, this city is now in as bad a condition as respects Irish pauperism and disease as any city or town in the most afflicted districts of Ireland itself. Independent of the infirmary and every other customary receptacle for fever patients being quite filled with these persons, they are to be seen every day squatting in swarms on the riverbanks beside the bridges, and individuals are often found stretched in a state of suffering and covered with rags and filth in the public thoroughfare. in 1850, the death toll of An Gortamór in County Donegal was in excess of 13,000 people. The death toll across Ulster was approximately 111,000 people. The toll is likely to be higher still, given that baptismal records are an insufficient means of tracking deaths, as many infants perished before they were baptized, some in transit as they, along with their mothers, flocked to new lands. The legacy of the famine in Donegal is seen today in the so-called paupers' graveyards and heritage sites, and items that include the huge iron boiling pots for soup scattered around the county and in the abandoned 19th century villages. In districts where the landlords were absent or in caring, the poor were especially vulnerable. Captain Jones, an agent of the British Relief Association, described the conditions of poor in Donegal and Mullaghderrig as wretched, remarking that they belong to nobody and nobody seems to take much interest in their welfare. They are therefore in the hands of the British Relief Association to keep them alive. His statements give an insight into the importance of private charity in assisting the poor, especially in marginalised or peripheral areas where government relief was totally inadequate and the local landowners, many of them, were absent. Evictions, as historian Christine Keneally has noted, they had commenced before the famine, and they added homelessness to the problem of hunger. Of all the Ulster counties, Donegal witnessed some of the highest eviction rates, standing at almost 16%. Approximately 40,000 people died or emigrated from County Donegal alone between the years 1846 and 1851. However, it was not simply the demographic loss that made it the Great Hunger and so devastating. Evictions, which were followed by the destruction of houses of the poor, together with a gradual move to pastoral farming, would change the landscape forever. Less easy to quantify or capture in a tangible way is the cultural loss that was experienced and remains with us today. Perhaps most stark was the damage on the Irish language. In the early part of the 1800s, approximately 40% of the population of Ireland spoke Irish. Those who died or immigrated in the famine were disproportionately Irish language speakers, mainly because the famine hit rural areas hardest, areas which are the highest rate of Irish speakers. In 1861, a decade after An Gortamór, the number of Irish speakers had halved to 24%. This is from 40% in 1800. This decline continued for some years, reaching a low of 18% around 1926, when attempts at its revival were initiated by the new Irish government following an excellent report with maps on the state of the Irish language, the Mulcahy Report. However, as Cormac O'Grada has remarked, neither O'Connellite nor Fenian brands of nationalism did anything to foster Irish, and by the time a more advanced nationalist ideology adopted the old tongue, it was too late. As a descendant of a great hunger survivor from the Rosses in West Donegal put it, reflecting on the wider cultural impact of the years of suffering in her community. Recreation and leisure ceased. Poetry, music, and dancing died. These things were lost and completely forgotten. When life improved in other ways, these pursuits never returned as they had been. The famine killed everything. An Gortamór forced the people to abandon many of the informing cultural and collective impacts from their past, both physically and culturally. It permeated all aspects of life, as Desmond Higgins' poem puts it so well. The stink of famine hangs in the bushes still, in the sad Celtic hedges. You can catch it down the line of our landscape, get its taste on every meal. Listen, there is famine in our music, famine behind our faces. It is only a field away, has made us all immigrants guilty for having survived, has separated us from language, cut us from our culture, built blocks around belief, left us on our own, ashamed to be seen, walking out beauty so honoured by our ancestors. One of the most obvious and devastating effects of the famine was emigration. Although the famine itself resulted in about 1 million deaths, the resultant post-famine emigration caused the population to drop by a further 3 million. About 1 million of these are estimated to have emigrated in the immediate famine period, with the depression that followed continuing the decline until the second half of the 20th century. These emigrants largely ended up in North America, with some in Australia and in Britain. Census data show that between 1845 and 1855, 1.5 million people left for good. In 1845, emigration was at the pre-famine rate of 50,000 per year. In 1846, some 100,000 left, and emigration peaked in 1847 when 250,000 left. Over the next 5 years, the average figure was 200,000 per year before the numbers began to decline. By 1855, the rate was down to 70,000 per year. In the period of the famine decade, 1841 to 1850, when 1.3 million people emigrated overseas, of these 70% went to the United States, 28% to Canada, and 2% to Australia. Most people paid their own fares to make the trip, although perhaps a small number had their fares paid by their landlords. The cheapest fare was to Canada, priced around 55 shillings on what was the most dangerous route, with poor vessels and seamanship, resulting in the highest losses at sea. A fare to the United States cost between 70 and 100 shillings, depending on the ticket class. With many of the emigrants suffering from fever, coupled with the cramped and insanitary conditions on board, disease was rampant. It is estimated that perhaps on some routes, as many as 40% of steerage passengers, the lowest category of passenger accommodation on the ships, died either en route or immediately after survival. One witness commenting on event writes, "This vessel left with 476 passengers, of whom 158 died before arrival." A striking feature then of the missing famine narrative is perhaps our insufficient recognition of the fact that Garda Mór and its associated immigration impacted differently on various social classes among the Irish population. For example, when the potato crop failed in 1845, huge numbers were at risk, but some more than others. Perhaps 1.5 million landless labourers were virtually totally dependent on the potato, while it was a major component of the diet of a further 3 million, mainly cottiers and smallholders of the rural poor. It is worth recalling, too, that many different streams of immigration that constitute 19th century or post-famine families reflected different types of migrants with different capacities, not only in terms of their source or motivation, but in terms of their human and technical disposition. The 1.5 million, for example, who had immigrated earlier between 1815 and 1845 have been described by Garrod O'Tuig as Protestant and prudential. Famine and post-famine migrants, however, were largely desperately seeking survival itself. So while the emigrants of the period of 1545 drew strongly from the northern half of the country and North Munster and included a sizable Protestant element, towards the end of the period, the number of Catholics and the shared counties involved were increasing. Always standing behind our famine experience and the adjustment to it is the issue of land, an omnipresent theme in Irish history. The massive expansion in Ireland's population of 75% between 1780 and 1821 was assisted by the phenomenon of partible inheritance. That is, with a low life expectancy, unions were formed and children born on tiny parcels, people seizing their opportunity for life as fields gave way to families in the post-famine adjustment. The families would give way to fields with one male inheriting, one female marrying, and the rest of the females having, as Arnsberg and Kemble put it, to travel. They would put it like that in 1934. Land hunger went on to dominate Irish society after the famine, influencing Irish politics for all of the remaining century and the early decades of the 20th. Given this foundational part of our historical experience, it is easy to understand how the continuing issues of food security and food sovereignty in our contemporary world, of course, resonate so profoundly with us as a people and must feature in our ethical reflections and our responses as we commemorate the period of An Garta Mór. The strong commitment of the Irish people to humanitarian aid and relief is, of course, strongly related to our own past struggle with hunger that is ingrained in our collective memory. We make this commitment, however, not only urged by memory, as we may be, but because it is the right and moral thing to do. It is an example of the Irishness we wish to be known by, one grounded in decency, ethical principles, and taking our share of global responsibility. Many, including the distinguished economist Amartya Sen, have correctly insisted that famine is almost always a predictable and preventable occurrence, if only there is the political will to prevent it. Yet we live at a time that still allows extreme hunger and famine to exist. For example, as I speak in the Horn of Africa, they have entered their 6th consecutive failed rainy season, resulting in displacement of millions in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, who struggle to survive amid scarce water resources, hunger, and security and conflict. The dependence on the potato, a staple in the 19th century Irish diet, has been replicated too in contemporary African experience, where entire populations are perilously reliant on 3 food staples, wheat, rice, and maize. And these are imported to a dangerous level of dependency and subject to speculation on the markets. Such dependency, with a range of local food sources being threatened by the consequences of climate change to which they have not contributed, has contributed to mass hunger and starvation. Earlier this year, I traveled to Senegal to address the 2nd African Food Security Conference. I highlighted there that there is an urgent need to tackle hunger in Africa through proper security in the basic necessities of life. I spoke of the importance of delivering universal basic services and creating a lasting, sustainable future built on security in its most inclusive sense, its most important sense, one grounded on a food security informed by indigenous wisdom. We have a moral and ethical responsibility to support our global family in dire need, to help with sustainable solutions, to ending all famines wherever they occur on our shared vulnerable planet, and to provide a decisive response to climate change, which itself is leading to an increased incidence of famines globally. Failure to act to prevent famines worldwide does not merely make an echo. It repeats and merely replicates the doctrines of inaction, moralism, and laissez-faire policies that precipitated the Irish famine. They contribute to mass displacement, such as that which we now see in Africa. Our experience of migration, too, has parallels that are contemporary in the 5 years between 2018 and today as I speak. According to a recent report by Caminando Fronteras, 11,286 people died trying to enter Spanish territory from Africa, almost all of them at sea, and this excludes the many who die before it make it to the coast. The United Nations Migration Agency believes 2 people die in the Sahara for every 1 who drowns at sea. The parallels with An Garta Mór and the mass displacement it caused 175 years ago must not be lost on us. We have a moral duty and a great opportunity to continue to honor our commitments to those vulnerable and displaced who seek asylum and refuge in our shores. Agini Cor, as we mark An Garta Mór, that horrific period of starvation and disease in Ireland from 1845 to 1852, that constitutes the country's greatest social disaster, a defining calamity, that became part of the long story of betrayal and exploitation as part of a powerful empire, and which led to the growing involvement in Ireland, the movement in Ireland for land reform and independence from the United Kingdom. Let us do so within the prism of an ethical recall, in a manner that enables such a healing that leads to action today and to a concern for the lives of others. On Garta Mór must be acknowledged, and in a lasting way. Its painful and manifold legacies in time, they must be transacted for the benefit of us all and others, and in the name of an unbroken commitment to humanity. Mo bhuicas lib, mila bhuicas.
Is mór agin na focail spargaile sin a uachtarán. Aguini Ushla, ladies and gentlemen, co-authors Ceoltóirí Éireann, Mael Rui, will now perform musical pieces entitled For Ireland I Won't Tell Who She Is and Noreen Bawn. They will be followed by Acna Ní Gaeilgeoir, who will read 2 stories about the Great Famine collected locally in the 1930s as part of the school's folklore collection.
Extracts from the 1930s National School Folklore Collection. Seo leannas sleachta mas áwer a scríú pastí scoile an nún an áil a tá mar chuid do bháileach na scoil idir na blianta 1936 go dtí 1938. Bhailí pastí hún an áil na contasí seo ó na górsain, ó na dismithirí agus ó na seantismithirí. Áwer é seo a bhhair go beá a gibhne na naoine, do bhhair uafais, do bhhair tromíochta agus do bhhair aspa ceannaireachta a bhainins le gárta. Edward Toland, Doe Island. The famine began in 1846, owing to the failure of the potato crop. The blight attacked the potato stalks in July of that year, and in one night they were all gone. The year 46 was called Blian na Scigan, the year of the small potatoes, for only small potatoes were dug up in that year. The majority of the people had no seed in 1847, and the people tried to live by eating docks, nettles, prashaga, and other herbs. The folk of this locality, the Isle of Doe, were fishermen, and God sent great numbers of fish in the sea, and the men pursued their calling, which saved a few from starvation. But great numbers died by the mountainside. As time went on, things looked black. People perished by the ditches and were never buried. Coffins were made with false bottoms, which dropped the dead in the graves, and were then taken back for more dead. During this awful time, the powers looked on and did nothing amidst death and desertion. Corn in great quantities was shipped abroad, what should have been held for the people. Prunches Macatir, Bala Vihil. We are cud war dini, basin sa chanter shaw, Marialer an acca Johannic na preti. Vich dig file wash, cushy valley war, agus na dini vi bia, vi she's whole lug shin, na joculio, na carpna a umper on the hoya. Nurobia erbi, the nichoku, a turnipy agus kyle. Nadini be rudbug ariga joku, dama veen your rudbug minna a Chaichid a gal fiha, milia, le mulia, agus yilchid ni bean a font. Donegal o Friel, Bala Vihil. Lia a drahil go trum er chanter shaw, where cudwar dini bas le ocris. Agus la wan, hanig faris ja go cha ni chonila, agus vi ocris morer. Hug ban jan brahanda, agus gishe agus hug she chaluda, agus gishe agus nervishe etche ege, where she bas. Where u ban agus calin bug in the lia maru, hús an ach, dar a vanyam glian, hús a burt a talin. Grace MacDade, Bally Harry. Many people died on account of the famine and were put in boxes and buried everywhere. In a field in Ballyharry, there is a wee hill, and there is supposed to be many coffins buried there. A lot of sickness followed the famine. The people did not get over it for years. They lost all courage, and it is said that they could never tell a story as well afterwards. the people were in a bad state. In order to keep themselves living, the people bled cattle and drank the blood. And one beast was bled 3 times in 3 months. The blood was mixed with a little meal and cooked. And it is said that one coffin did 50 persons. And it is said a person was carried on a coffin and thrown into a grave. Then the next person was carried in the coffin to the same grave. In this way, about 50 persons were buried in one single grave. A student in Carrick na Heorna School, Ballyshannon. In the year 1846, the people died and starved on the roadside. The blight came on the potatoes on the night of the 12th of July in 1846. And on that day, a man in this district named James Walsh was weeding his potatoes in a garden. And when he would stand up, the potato tops were as high as his waist. The next day, when this man came out to continue his work, the rich tops were lying rotten. When the potatoes all rotted and the corn and all the crops were lost, people went out onto the roads and sat on the ditches to die of hunger. Some people were not able to pay the rent, and the landlords threw them out of their houses, and they died on the roadside. Seamus O'Brien, Mean Daya. Golle drochiel go mór wantir na háte seo. Bhí an chuide smó acu, agus ní roi jaharbi acu le hithe. San am sin bhí a wad ní smó daoine sa cheantar seo na mar atá an inis. A bhíar chuid acu bás leis an ocras agus Jimmy an chuid eile go America imice. Ad agus a war an drochiel, feich bar na breti. Ach má bhrón, hanig aca jorú, agus feisi dre cion agus cion. Agus an féid des na preti a bhí sáwailte, liochi siad an sna poil. Agus ní ró rompu, ach an tanas. Bhí tea fa chunne na boicht an nún fanahi. Agus coiú an chud a ba waikte, dífis tea sa tea seo.
Aghuini Ushla, ladies and gentlemen, Mairead Vuini will now perform Doon the Hill. This will be followed by a reading of Seamus Heaney's poem At a Potato Digging by Conall Byrne and Evie Shields from Mulroy College, Milford, and Ailish Russell and David Kennedy from Loretto Community School, Milford.
Out of Potato Digging by Seamus Heaney. A mechanical digger wrecks the drill, spins up a dark shower of roots and mould. Labourers swarm in behind, stoop to fill wicker creels. Fingers go dead in the cold. Like crows attacking crow-black fields, they stretch a higgledy line from hedge to headland. Some pairs keep breaking ragged ranks to fetch a full creel to the pit and straighten. Stand tall for a moment, but soon stumble back to fish a new load from the crumbled surf. Heads bow, trunks bend, hands fumble towards the black mother. Processional stooping through the turf recurs mindlessly as autumn. Centuries of fear and homage to the famine god toughen the muscles behind their humbled knees. Make a seasonal altar of the sod.
Flint white, purple. Flint white, purple. They lie scattered like inflated pebbles. Native to the black hutch of clay where the halved seed shot and clotted, these knobbed and slit-eyed tubers seem the petrified hearts of drills. Split by the spade, they show white as cream. Good smells exude from crumbled earth. The rough bark of hummus erupts knots of potatoes, a clean birth, whose solid feel, whose wet inside promises taste of ground and root, to be piled in pits, live skulls, blind-eyed.
Live skulls, blind-eyed, balanced on wild, higgledy skeletons, scoured the land in 45, wolfed the blighted root and died. The new potato, sound as stone, putrefied when it had lain 3 days in the long clay pit. Millions rotted along with it. Mouths tightened in, eyes dyed hard, faces chilled to a plucked bird. In a million wicker huts, beaks of famine snipped at guts. A people hungering from birth, grubbing like plants in the bitch earth, were grafted with a great sorrow, hope rotted like a marrow. Stinking potatoes fouled the land, pits turned pus into filthy mounds, and where potato diggers are, you still smell the running sore.
Under a gay flotilla of gulls, the rhythm deadens. The workers stop. Brown bread and tea in bright canfuls are served for lunch. Dead beat, they flop down in the ditch and take their fill thankfully, breaking timeless fasts. Then, stretched on the faithless ground, spill libations of cold tea, scatter crusts.
Greenie Ushla, I would now like to invite Father Jerry Carroll, chaplain to the Defence Forces, to lead a prayer for the victims of the famine.
Nani Manar, agus an Vic, agus an Spirit Nave. Idea. Arnyar. Tomij togda le kele. Kun we our son gak ena a fur boss. A dueling, agus a gimmick, Emrika, ire an Gorhamore. As we remember, all who suffered and died in the course of the Great Famine, we stand in solidarity this day with all who experience hunger and pain. In your goodness, Lord, you created a world of abundance with more than enough to sustain all of creation. We seek to live in a world where a simpler lifestyle would make it easier for others to live. Where we recognize you in the least of our sisters and brothers. Where we actively seek the goodness that you intend for all creation. In memory of all the victims of our great famine, all who died, all who survived and lived with pain, all who emigrated, all who made our ancestors welcome in foreign lands. Today, in their memory, and conscious of our own woundedness and imperfections, we seek forgiveness for the times that we knowingly or unknowingly turn our backs on those who struggle. Lord, may we never take for granted the peace that we presently experience, the homes in which we live, and the food we presently enjoy. We make this our prayer through Christ our Lord. In anim and nara, agus an vic, agus a spirit nave. Amen.
Marshal! Gardner, ready, folk? Gardner, start! Gardner, a mark, a P. Gardner, la harv, onyesh, to see. Gardner, darky, right. Gardner, Humphrey, Adam. Gardner, Shasit, Rose.
Agreeni Ushla. We will now have the unveiling of a commemorative stone and a tree planting, followed by the wreath-laying ceremony, where President Higgins, His Excellency the Most Reverend Louis Mariano Montemayor, Apostolic Nuncio, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, and Councillor Liam Blaney, Cathaoirleach of Donegal County Council, will lay wreaths. Minister.
I now invite President Higgins to unveil the commemorative stone and to plant an oak tree in memory of the victims of the Great Famine, and particularly all who died here in Donegal. President Higgins will be assisted by Alessandra Serra from Air Hill National School and Nathan King from Creeslaw National School. I also invite President Higgins thereafter to lay a wreath on behalf of the people of Ireland in memory of those who suffered, died and emigrated during the Great Famine.
Augtaran a ara agus a gcuine úsla ila. Curfimid túsanis leis an tríú chuid den Seamus Cuivnachan on Stát don Ghirt de Mór. I invite you now to stand for the wreath-laying ceremony.
Gardnora! Ara! Gardnora! Asham Freak! Adam! Gardnora! Airarm! Asham Fra! Lee!
A minute of silence will now be observed for all those who died during the Great Famine. Agrini Ushla Illa. This concludes the 2023 National Famine Commemoration Ceremony. On behalf of all here present, may I express our sincere thanks to President Michael D. Higgins for his presence and for his participation in today's National Famine Commemoration Ceremony. Agrini Ushla Agus Aina Illa. Thank you all for attending today's ceremony. You are all welcome to some light refreshments in the marquee to the side of this stage following the conclusion of the ceremony. I would request that guests remain in their seats or allocated areas until directed, and then to follow the directions of the stewards at all times. Gurma Agiv Illa.